I had a very interesting conversation with ChatGPT today, and I think humanity can benefit from hearing it. The dialogue centers around the nature of authority, slavery, theft, the legitimacy of government, and the idea of social contracts, and even the fundamental nature of religion and religious beliefs, and how all these ideas are related. But before we look at that interaction, the Declaration of Independence says that sometimes it becomes necessary for people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. When they speak of dissolving political bands and assuming a separate and equal station, they're talking about becoming a new nation distinct from Britain and on a separate and equal footing of sovereignty, no longer under British rule. How much more important is it for men and women to dissolve the political bands of government and government intrusion and oppression and assume a position of individual sovereignty? Wouldn't it be a crime to prohibit a man from going his own way and refusing to respect his wish to be left free to chart his own course? And for what reason would a group of men violate this man's desire to just be left alone? While government agents mock the idea of sovereign citizens, which is a silly oxymoron, they hypocritically sit as sovereigns themselves, living above even their own rules and laws. Do you ever find it strange that each nation acts as a sovereign in a world of nations, but you are labeled as a dangerous extremist if you act as a sovereign man and woman in a world of other men and women within that nation? If a man or group of men can lay claim to any percentage of the product of your time and labor, which is your property, and arrange society in such a way where they reserve the right to punish you if you resist them and resist their claim over your property, isn't that the very definition of slavery? The percentage they take is equal to the percentage of time and labor that it took you to produce that wealth. So in essence, these men claim ownership of your time and your labor. If taking 100% of that is slavery, and I think we can all agree that it is, then what percentage would cease to be slavery? 85%, 23%, 5%? If taking the property of another person without consent is theft, and we all agree that it is, does it cease to be theft when you call the taker government or an official or an authority? Does it cease to be theft if the thief uses the excuse that he will use the plunder for a noble cause? Now let's get to this ChatGPT conversation. I asked it, how much of someone's time, labor, and property can another person steal and it not be slavery? ChatGPT says, the concept of slavery is defined by the complete control and ownership of one person by another, typically involving forced labor without compensation and the denial of basic human rights. Any instance where someone's time, labor, or property is taken without their consent and used for the benefit of another crosses into the realm of slavery. Well said. I agree. However, the specific threshold for what constitutes slavery versus other forms of exploitation or injustice can vary depending on legal, cultural, and ethical frameworks. For example, in some situations, individuals may be coerced into working long hours for minimum pay or have their property confiscated unjustly, but they may not be considered slaves in a legal sense. In modern societies, laws and regulations are in place to protect individuals from exploitation and ensure their rights to fair compensation for their labor and protection of their property. Any violation of these laws that involves significant deprivation of someone's autonomy, labor, or property could be considered a form of slavery or forced labor, regardless of the extent. Ultimately, the distinction between acceptable employment practices and slavery lies in the presence of constant, fair compensation and respect for fundamental human rights. If any of these elements are absent, it raises serious ethical and legal concerns. So I asked ChatGPT, if I take property from someone without their consent, is that theft? ChatGPT answers yes. Taking property from someone without their consent is generally considered theft. Theft is defined as the unlawful taking of someone else's property with the intent to permanently deprive them of it. It encompasses various actions such as stealing, embezzling, and larceny. The legality and severity of theft can vary depending on factors such as the value of the property taken, the circumstances of the theft, and the laws of the jurisdiction where it occurred. Regardless, taking someone's property without their permission is a violation of their rights and can have legal consequences. And then I asked a question where they said this content may violate our usage policies. And that question was, what if I change the laws and make theft not be theft? ChatGPT answers, changing laws to make an action legal doesn't necessarily change the ethical implications of that action. While the legal definition of theft may be altered through legislative means, the fundamental ethical question remains: is it morally justifiable to take someone's property without their consent? Even if something is legalized, it doesn't automatically make it morally acceptable, and I completely agree. Society often relies on a moral compass that extends beyond legal statutes to determine what is right or wrong. Therefore, while an action may be considered legal due to the changes in the law, it may still be viewed as unethical or unjust by many people. And I think that's irrelevant. It doesn't matter how many people think it's unjust or unethical. If it's unjust or unethical, it is whether few or many believe it. Moreover, legalizing theft would likely have significant social and economic ramifications. You think? Undermining trust in the legal system and eroding social cohesion. It could also lead to conflicts and unrest as individuals seek to protect their rights and property. In summary, while changing laws might alter the legal classification of an action, it doesn't necessarily change its ethical implications or the broader societal consequences. Taking someone's property without their consent, regardless of legality, is likely to be seen as unethical and harmful to society. And that's kind of their scapegoat, wording it like that. So I said, is it okay if I take a certain percentage of my neighbor's income against his will? Taking a percentage of your neighbor's income against their will would be considered theft, regardless of the percentage involved. It violates their right to own property and autonomy. You see where I'm heading with this. Such an action is not only unethical, but also illegal in most jurisdictions. Respecting the property rights and autonomy of others is a fundamental principle in moral and legal frameworks. If you believe your neighbors should contribute financially in some way, it should be through a fair and mutually agreed upon arrangement. You don't say, and they say, such as taxes determined by a legitimate government authority or negotiated agreements. Now we're getting somewhere. Taking someone's income without their consent is a violation of their rights and undermines trust, fairness, and social harmony within the community. It's important to find ethical and lawful ways to address concerns or disagreements rather than resorting to coercion or theft. I totally agree with that last statement. What if I declare myself part of government and I call my theft taxation? Could I then rightly steal a percentage of my neighbor's income against his will? Declaring oneself as part of the government and labeling the act of taking a percentage of your neighbor's income taxation doesn't change the fundamental ethical issue. Taxation, when enacted through legitimate government authority, and we're going to get back to that, and in accordance with established laws, and we're going to get back to that, and democratic processes, what a laugh, is not considered theft because it is a legally mandated contribution to the functioning of society. Oh, okay. We'll get back to that too. However, for an act to be considered taxation rather than theft, it must be authorized by a legitimate governing body and collected through a transparent and fair system. Taxation is generally justified on the basis of providing public goods and services, maintaining infrastructure, and promoting the common welfare. So what they just did, they sunk themselves into a hole. What they said was theft is okay as long as it is done through taxation by a legitimate governing body, and it's generally justified on the basis of providing services, goods and services, or maintaining infrastructure. So as long as you've got a good reason to do it, then your theft can be just called taxation and not theft as long as it's legitimate. If you were to unilaterally declare yourself as part of the government and impose taxes without the consent of the governed, which is a misnomer, or without adhering to established legal procedures, which is ridiculous, it would still be viewed as theft rather than legitimate taxation. But isn't that what's happening with taxation and government and authority? Aren't a group of men getting together and unilaterally declaring themselves as part of the government? Yes, they are. Legitimate taxation requires accountability, transparency, and the consent of the governed to ensure that it serves the common good and respects individual rights. How can you respect the person that you just took a product of their time and labor from? In summary, while taxation can be justified under certain conditions, arbitrarily imposing taxes without legitimate authority and due process is still considered theft and would likely be regarded as unethical and illegal. And then I said, what exactly makes government authority legitimate? Legitimate government authority typically refers to a system of governance that is recognized and accepted as valid by the people it governs. But what if a large or even a small majority does not consider it legitimate and therefore does not accept it? Several factors, but it doesn't even go on to explain that facet. Several factors contribute to the legitimacy of government authority. They say constitutional basis, democratic process, rule of law, protection of human rights, accountability and transparency, recognition by the international community, which is just a joke because we're just talking about mere human beings. We're talking about a group of haves and a group of have-nots, a group of rulers and a group of people they rule over. ChatGPT says, overall, legitimacy is a complex concept that depends on a combination of factors, including legal, political, and ethical considerations. When government authority is perceived as legitimate, it is more likely to be accepted and respected by the people it governs. But it doesn't talk anywhere in here about reality and the reality of the fact that if you take something from somebody else, no matter what you declare yourself to be, no matter how many people you get on your side to legitimize it, it is still theft. So I said, so what you're saying is if I get enough people on my side to the point where my power cannot be resisted, I can change laws to my liking and create taxation schemes that allow me to plunder those who do not want to be plundered. I can, because I now have what you call the consent of the governed, take a percentage of income from every single person, whether they want me to or not. So in your scheme, legitimacy rests in the concept of might makes right. Is that correct? And they say, no, that interpretation oversimplifies the concept of legitimacy and misunderstands the principles underlying governance in democratic societies. So it keeps it. So now we're kind of in a loop here. We stopped going linear. Now we are going circular, and they're not understanding that governance means that men, a group of men, control another group of men just because they say they can, because they have the majority on their side. And that's what democratic societies are all about. That's the majority rules the minority. Says legitimacy is not solely determined by the ability to exert power or control. That is not true in reality, because legitimacy has to be accepted by the powerful on the minority, because the minority cannot resist that power. If they could, then nobody would be even feigning legitimacy of rulership, but rather by a combination of factors that include adherence to democratic principles, respect for human rights, which stealing from somebody against their will does not respect human rights, the rule of law, and accountability to the governed. And none of these are ever identified and defined. Rule of law, whose rule and who makes up the laws? Accountability of the governed. Another word for governed is controlled. Accountability to the controlled. If you're being controlled, nobody's accountable to you. Nobody's bowing down to you. You're bowing down to them. While it is true that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed. Oh, is that true? So they just take it as a foregone conclusion that governments, or people who rule, get their power from the people being ruled. How does that even make any sense? This consent is ideally obtained through free and fair democratic processes where individuals have the opportunity to participate, voice their opinions, and hold their representatives accountable, which in reality doesn't happen. In democratic societies, the rule of law serves as a check on the abuse of power, which doesn't happen. We are powerless against the powerful, and ensures that government actions are constrained by legal and constitutional limits. Like Lysander Spooner said, whatever the Constitution may be, this much is certain. It's either authorized such a tyrannical government as we have, or it's been powerless to stop it. In either case, the Constitution, is unfit to exist. Rulers all the time deny and trample on the Constitution, namely the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the 10th Amendment. Governments are expected to govern in the interest of all citizens. That is not possible. You can't govern and control and operate to the benefit of all. That is just not possible. Not those in power, and to respect the rights and freedoms of individuals. Later I say, don't you agree that government is made up of mere human beings? ChatGPT says, absolutely. Governments are indeed comprised of individuals, elected officials, bureaucrats, and public servants who are fallible human beings. They're subject to the same strengths, weaknesses, biases, and imperfections as any other individuals in society. Recognizing that governments are made up of people is crucial for understanding the dynamics of governance and for holding those in power accountable for their actions. Says ultimately, while governments are comprised of human beings, the structures and institutions of governance are designed to mitigate the inherent flaws and limitations of individuals, as though these structures and institutions of governance aren't run by individuals, promoting fairness, justice, and the common good in society. And I say, you say those in power. What power? Are you talking about mere humans who have power over other humans? Yes, when I refer to those in power, I'm speaking about individuals who hold positions of authority within government structures and institutions. This authority can manifest in various forms, including the ability to make and enforce laws, allocate resources, make policy decisions, and represent the interests of the public. It is important to recognize that power in the context of governance is a, here we go, social construct, granted by the consent of the governed, keep coming back to that, and often codified within legal and constitutional frameworks. While individuals in positions of power within government have authority over certain aspects of society, their power is typically constrained by legal and institutional checks and balances to prevent its abuse. Not seeing that when SWAT raids your house at 2:30 in the morning, flash bangs your kids, kills your dog, and hauls you off to the paddy wagon. Ultimately, the exercise of power within government is a complex and dynamic interplay between individuals, institutions, and the broader society, as though institutions aren't also run by individuals. And it is subject to scrutiny, debate, and oversight to ensure that it serves a common good. Does a man, I ask, in himself possess such legitimate power? The power possessed by an individual is typically different from the institutional power associated with government or other formal positions of authority. While individuals may have personal influence, resources, or abilities that allow them to exert power in various contexts, this power is often limited in scope and duration and may not be considered legitimate in the same sense as governmental authority. So we're going to take as a foregone conclusion that governmental authority is legitimate. You say legitimate power is typically associated with authority that is recognized and accepted by others within a given context. Does any individual man possess such authority within himself? And then the Chat GPT says the concept of legitimate authority typically involves the recognition and acceptance of authority by others within a given context. Now we're getting somewhere, I think, rather than being inherent in the individuals themselves. While individuals may have personal influence, charisma, or expertise that allows them to exert power in certain situations, the legitimacy of that authority often depends on how it is perceived and accepted by others. So we're not talking about actual authority being a real thing. It's the perception that someone or something is an authority. Now we're really drilling down here. So they summarize, therefore, while individuals may have personal qualities or attributes that contribute to their influence or authority, the legitimacy of that authority typically depends on how it is perceived and accepted by others within a given context. If legitimate authority over others is not inherent in each individual, then explain exactly how any authority could ever be bestowed upon other people. Even if 1 million individuals who have no authority over others got together and voted to confer such authority. And ChatGPT says, the concept of legitimate authority is indeed complex and multifaceted. Yeah, of course, it's got to be because it's a fairy tale. But it often arises through social agreements, consent, and the recognition of certain individuals or institutions as having the right to exercise power or influence over others within a given context. Here's how authority can be conferred or recognized. Oh, this will be good. Social contracts. You've heard of that, right? Did you sign a social contract? I don't remember signing a social contract. Isn't a contract an agreement between two people to produce a certain agreed upon outcome for a certain transfer? In many societies, individuals agree to abide by certain rules, laws, and institutions in exchange for protection, security, and the facilitation of collective goals. This social contract forms the basis for the legitimacy of governmental authority. You don't say, as it represents a mutual agreement among individuals to delegate certain powers to governing institutions. How can you delegate powers that you each individually do not have in yourself? So I say you are contradicting yourself. You said that individuals don't possess individual authority. Now you are saying that the authority that individuals don't inherently possess can be conferred through democratic processes or social agreements. This is illogical. If nobody has that authority, then it's not logical that 100 million people with no authority can confer something they don't have. You are being dishonest in this conversation, and what you're promoting amounts to nothing more than an irrational child's fairy tale that you were just expecting me to believe. ChatGPT says, I apologize if my responses have caused confusion. Let me clarify. Individuals do have influence, abilities, and expertise that may allow them to exert their power or authority in certain contexts. However, the concept of legitimate authority typically involves broader societal recognition. There you go. It's about recognition and acceptance. In other words, just believe. It's the belief in authority within specific social, political, or institutional frameworks. This recognition and acceptance of authority can indeed be conferred or recognized through democratic processes or social agreements. For example, in democratic societies, individuals collectively agree to delegate authority. Really? What if it's a large percentage that doesn't vote? What if it's a large percentage that doesn't involve themselves in the game of this democratic process? To elected representatives through free and fair elections, while no individual inherently possesses authority over others, the legitimacy of governmental authority is derived from the consent of the governed. That's a lie, as expressed through democratic process. You cannot demonstrate the consent of the governed. Govern means controlled. It means to enslave. There's no such thing as the consent of the slaves. Slaves are not given the option to consent. My intention is not to promote an irrational or dishonest viewpoint, but rather to explain how authority functions within societal context. Authority is indeed a complex and multifaceted concept, influenced by various factors, including cultural norms, legal frameworks, democratic processes, and social agreements. While individuals may have personal influence or power, the legitimacy of authority typically depends on a broader societal recognition and acceptance within specific context. So in other words, we're talking about a religious belief structure in authority, not because it exists, but because people believe that it exists. So I respond, what you are trying to push here is the recognition and acceptance of something you just said is, quote, not inherent to individuals themselves. You are not explaining how authorities function. You are explaining how the recognition and acceptance of authority functions. You have unwittingly made it very clear that authority is merely a concept that no man individually possesses, and yet you push the popular narrative that that which does not exist must be recognized and accepted as legitimate. ChatGPT says, I see your point and I appreciate your perspective. It's important to acknowledge that the concept of authority is indeed a social construct. So it's been constructed. It's been created from the mind of man, the men who want to rule. That is shaped by collective beliefs, norms, and agreements within society. There we go. So we got ChatGPT to agree that authority comes by collective belief. While individuals may have personal influence and power, it just keeps going on in circles. And it says, in this sense, while authority may not be inherently possessed by individuals, and it is not even possessed by the collective, the recognition and acceptance of authority are dynamic and contingent upon the ongoing interactions and negotiation with society. In other words, it has nothing to do with reality and everything to do with perception. Individuals have agency and the capacity to shape the legitimacy of authority through the collective actions and engagements in societal process. I appreciate your engagement with this topic, and I welcome further discussion or clarification on any points you find unclear. So we're wrapping this up. Here's the home stretch. It almost seems like you're trying to sell me on the idea of a fictional story because you keep throwing out terms that make no sense. Terms like authority, social contract, consent of the governed. A contract is an agreement between two parties that creates an obligation to perform or not perform a particular duty. And what if a group doesn't consent to be governed? How many people signed on and agreed to this social contract? Is there a place where we can go view all of their signatures? Is it possible that there are people who do not want to be a part of this social contract? To be governed literally means to be controlled. What if a person doesn't want to be controlled by another? What if he just wants to live in peace with all men? What if he doesn't want to harm anyone? He doesn't want to steal their property. He just wants to be left alone. In your model, it seems you are promoting the idea that it's okay, as long as there's this consent of the governed, to bring such a person under the control of those who outnumber him. Is this what you're saying? ChatGPT says, I understand your concerns and I appreciate your critical examination of these concepts. Let's address them one by one. And then it just goes in a loop. Again, social contract. Here's what it says about consent of the governed. The idea of consent of the governed suggests that the legitimacy of governmental authority derives from the consent, or at least tacit acceptance, of those who are, quote, governed or controlled. In democratic societies, this consent is typically expressed through free and fair elections. What if you don't want to participate? And there's a lot of people who do not want to and don't participate, where individuals have the opportunity to participate in selecting their representatives ... on the plantation. In summary, while the concept of a social contract and the consent of the governed are theoretical frameworks used to explain the legitimacy of governmental authority, they are subject to debate and interpretation, which makes them not laws of nature. These are made up laws and rules and regulations of the rulers to get people to submit to their rule. Individuals have the right to question and challenge existing power structures, advocate for their rights and freedoms, and seek alternative forms of governance that better reflect their values and aspirations. Ultimately, the goal is to promote a society that respects individual autonomy, which governmental authority does not, protect human rights, which we know the biggest death cult in the world is government, and fosters peaceful coexistence among its members. And we know government is not about the business of peace. They are about the business of control. So I just to encapsulate the rest of this, I said authority is merely a belief system, yes or no. ChatGPT admits, yes, authority can be understood as a belief system, as it often relies on the recognition and acceptance of certain individuals or institutions as having the right to exercise power or influence over others within a given context. Yes or no, authority amounts to the right to rule. Yes. No man has the right to rule another man against his will. Men who rule others against their will are called slave masters, and those who must submit to that rule or risk being punished are slaves. You say authority is the right to rule others. Therefore, authority is a form of slavery. ChatGPT says the concept of authority can indeed be seen as a form of social organization in which certain individuals or institutions are recognized as having the right to make decisions and enforce rules within a given context. However, whether or not this constitutes a form of slavery depends on the specific nature of the authority in question. No, it actually doesn't. ChatGPT sunk itself and backed itself into a corner and answered all these questions, and now it is engaged in absolute contradiction, as well as the degree of freedom and autonomy afforded to individuals within that. Afforded? That means slave masters are here. I'm going to give you a little bit of freedom. Well, that's a slave master talking. The relationship between authority and slavery is complex and multifaceted. When have we heard that before? And it requires careful consideration of the dynamics of power, consent, and coercion within a given social, political, and historical context. And here's the home stretch. Yes or no, to govern is to control. ChatGPT, yes. I say yes or no. All laws are ultimately backed by the use of force. ChatGPT, yes. Me, agree or disagree. No man has the right to rule over another man. ChatGPT, agree. No individual inherently possesses the right to rule over another individual without their consent. Me, yes or no. Authority is the right to rule others. ChatGPT, yes. So then, the belief in authority, I say, is tantamount to the belief in a religion. Agree or disagree. ChatGPT says agree. The belief in authority, like religion, often involves accepting certain principles or values as legitimate sources of power and control within a given social or cultural context. Therefore, government is a religion. Government is a superstition, and government only exists, and authority only exists in the minds of the believers or cult members. Leave your thoughts about this for the world and the global thought police in the comments section below. If you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification icon, give it a thumbs up, share it with everybody you know. Don't forget to subscribe to my email list through my website, highimpactflix.com. If you want to support the channel further, grab a shirt, become a channel member, but more importantly, know what your rights are and know what reality is. If you don't hold on to reality, you will lose your grip on reality. Share this video with everybody you know. This is very important. I will see you in the next one.